transients is exciting new field, and he'll be talking about the challenges of this and the interesting physics we can get out of it. Shreyas, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dipanjan. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, the searching for radio transient, the first slide. Yes, we can see.
Yeah. Hi everyone. It's great to be here. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and organizing such a really nice conference. Today I'm going to tell you about the challenges of searching for radio transients. It's a huge computational challenge, and I'm going to tell you about how we have approached it for this telescope in particular, the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, which you see in the background. We spent a fair amount of time working on the hardware and software of this telescope, and now it is the world's foremost telescope in finding radio transients. And this, of course, is not a thing which is done by one person. This is on behalf of a huge collaboration, and you can see that a lot of the people, from undergraduate students to emeritus professors, have actually put blood, sweat, and tears into building this telescope, its electronics, and the software. So in today's talk, I'm going to tell you first about fast radio bursts, which is one specific type of radio transient that is really exciting. And I'm going to tell you why it is exciting. I'll give you some context about these kinds of transients and what makes us search for them. Why should we search for them? Then I'll talk about the challenges of finding FRBs, and all throughout this I'll use the CHIME FRB pipeline as an example. There are three main tasks which we need to do to detect any kind of signal. One is to remove noise. So there is some sort of radio frequency interference removal or RFI removal. We need to do a de-dispersion, which Bhaswati talked about in the previous talk as well, but I'll go into a bit more detail right now. And then we need to do some sort of match filtering. We need to see how we can separate the signals we are looking for from the noise. So we'll talk in detail about that. Then I'll talk about some of the newer methods which are used for transient hunting, the convolutional neural networks, for example. Towards the end, I'll briefly touch upon 2 or 3 philosophical points about how do you design a filter or a pipeline to search for unknown transients. If you are exploring the unknown, what do you need to think about? And then at the end, I'll talk about computing as an instrument rather than as a resource which is done centrally. So without much ado, let's talk about fast radio bursts. So fast radio bursts, or FRBs, are these very bright flashes of radio emission. So you can see this animation on the top right-hand side corner. They seem to come from random directions in the sky. The speed at which they are showing up in this animation is, of course, not in real time, but there are a lot of them. There are about 1,000 of these FRBs every day in the entire sky at brightnesses that are detectable by normal telescopes. And that makes these the most prolific transients that we see. And despite that, we have only started discovering them only about a decade ago. Radio astronomy itself started, almost in 1940s or 50s, and since then we have never discovered them. We are discovering them only now, and there are a lot of reasons for them. The first of which is that computation was very expensive, and now it has become cheaper. And I'll talk about the computational challenges involved in finding these fast radio bursts. At the bottom, I'm showing you a dynamic spectrum of a fast radio burst in the data. So, Dipanjan, can everybody see my mouse?
Can you move the mouse again? It's lost a bit. I can see the mouse. I can see the mouse. Yes.
OK, great. Thank you.
I can see the pointer.
Thank you. Yeah. So in this plot, what I'm showing you is the intensity of radio emission at a particular frequency and at a particular time. The frequency is plotted on the vertical axis from about 1.2 gigahertz to 1.5 gigahertz. And on the horizontal axis is the time in milliseconds. And the black and white intensity indicates, black and white color indicates the intensity. Black is brighter in this case. And you can see the FRB has arrived, FRB signal going from the top left to the bottom right. It arrives earlier at high frequencies and later at low frequencies. Okay, and this is a very crucial phenomena for astrophysical signals, that radio waves are dispersed by the interstellar medium. So you have plasma in the interstellar medium, and the speed of radio waves is dependent on the frequency. So high frequency radio waves travel faster so they arrive earlier at the telescope, and low frequency radio waves arrive later because they travel slower. And the shape of this curve is very well understood to be frequency to the -2. It is a parabolic shape. But the total magnitude of this effect from the highest frequency to the lowest frequency is dependent on something called the dispersion measure, which is the integral of the number of electrons from the source to the observer. So basically, you're counting the number of electrons that the wave encounters from the source to the observer. And that is not known a priori. So you have to search for it. And we'll talk in great detail about this search for the correct dispersion measure, which is known as d-dispersion. So what you do to find an FRB is to integrate along the expected dispersion curve. So you have to do a lot of trial dispersion measures. And then when you integrate the correct dispersion curve along these thin white lines, which are drawn to guide the eye, you can get the total intensity profile. So you get a time profile of total integrated intensity as a function of time. And you can see a very bright burst in there. So this is known as the time profile. And the match filtering is done on the time profile. So this DM is obviously a proxy for distance. And it turned out that because of the very high dispersion measures that we are seeing from these fast radio bursts, they are extragalactic in origin. In fact, they are coming from cosmological distances. And the weird thing is that these fast radio bursts are really bright. Some of them are as bright as cell phone signals, except that they're not coming from a cell phone tower 10 kilometers away. They are coming from halfway across the universe. So they have to have enormous amounts of energy. Okay. And we've found a few that they're repeating. Some of them are just one-off. You get one burst and you get nothing else. Some of them seem to repeat at random intervals. And we have localized a few to host galaxies, so we know the exact distances they're coming from. And it turns out that these FRBs are 1 trillion times brighter than the brightest pulsars we have ever seen. And we have no idea how to create radio pulses that are this bright. So there are a lot of different models. There are order of 70 or 80 different models which people have put forth as to what could be creating FRBs. So there is a lot of active research right now going on trying to figure out whether FRBs are coming from magnetars, are they from mergers of binary neutron stars, or is it something more exotic like axion nuggets going through neutron star magnetic fields and so on. So there's a lot of efforts at radio to find FRBs and at X-rays and optical wavelengths to find the counterparts of FRBs at other wavelengths. But there are a lot of challenges in finding FRBs. Okay, at CHIME we have been really successful, but it has not been easy. So what is the challenge in finding an FRB? So the first thing to consider is that the FRB lasts only for a millisecond. Some of them are even narrower than that. So they'll last only for microseconds. But the dispersion smear which you get, the time from when the FRB arrives at high frequencies and the time when it reaches when the lowest frequency reaches you can be over 10 to 20 seconds, depending on what frequency band you're operating in. So your signal is diluted by a factor of 10 to the 4. So you take your signal and you stretch it out over 10,000 times, right? And you mix it with a lot of noise. So unless you know the d-dispersion very, very precisely, you're not going to find your signal, even if it is really bright. So even the brightest FRBs need to be properly d-dispersed to be detectable. Otherwise, you're not going to find them at all. Okay. And the d-dispersion, the pulse width which you would want for optimal detection are not a priori known. So there is a huge search space. There is a 6-dimensional search space for these FRBs. And we have to search over all of it close to optimally to find these fast radio bursts. Now, this would have been very challenging on its own, even if your underlying noise was well behaved. If you had Gaussian noise or something which is very well understood, that would have been fine. That would have been hard enough. But we get radio frequency interference, and this comes from cell phone towers, it comes from aircraft, it comes from satellites, all over the place. Every human activity basically creates RFI, and that is the supreme enemy of all radio astronomers. We'll talk in great detail about that, but you can see some of the plots which I've put on the right hand side. This is again a dynamic spectrum, but there is no FRB in there, and you can see there are also sorts of patterns which are seen, which come from just terrestrial interference. The one on the bottom is actually from aircraft transit. As the aircraft goes through the telescope beam, it shows these weird long curves, some of which can get detected as false FRBs. So with all of this in mind, I will tell you about our telescope, the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, how we built it, and then what sort of computing goes on behind the scenes for it to be able to detect a lot of FRBs. So this is the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, or CHIME. It consists of 4 cylindrical telescopes. These are not telescopes in the way you might be used to imagining a telescope. They're fixed to the ground, so they look only straight up at the sky. Okay, each of these cylinders is about 20 meters wide and 100 meters long, and they're oriented north-south. And underneath these walkways, where you can see some of our team members standing, there are 1024 dual polarization feeds which operate from 400 to 800 megahertz. So each telescope cylinder has 256 of them, and then you combine the signals from all these feeds together in our correlator to form different to map a huge swath of the sky. So let me talk about that a little bit. Most telescopes are meant for deep observations of small parts of the sky. So GMRT, Parkes, Arecibo, they all have fields of view which are really, really small. They're, a fraction of a degree typically is the field of view. So I've plotted them as small circles here. But if you want to find FRBs or some other phenomena that occur randomly in different directions in the sky, you need to image huge swaths of the sky at once. So with that in mind, we have built CHIME, and there are also other telescopes like ASCAP, so ASCAP observes, for example, 40 square degrees or so. With CHIME, we are observing almost 250 square degrees. So that's a huge increase over previous telescopes. And that is what makes CHIME good at detecting fast radio bursts. We just survey a very large area of the sky. Now, the way CHIME observes the sky is a bit weird. It's you're basically looking straight up and the sky drifts overhead. So this is a map of the radio sky at about 400 megahertz. And the large ellipse is the full sky. This central circle is the sky above CHIME at any given point of time. And this large elliptical beam which you see is what a single antenna on a single cylinder of CHIME sees at any one point. What you can do later is you take all the 256 antennas and you can make 256 linear combinations of the input signals. So what you get is 256 beams going from north to south. And then you can take the 4 east-west antennas and then combine them again with 4 different linear combinations, which would make a grid of beams on the sky, which is 4 beams wide and 256 beams long. Now you can imagine this as a video camera, okay, which has 1024 pixels, which doesn't sound a lot, but it has instead of just RGB colors, it has 16,384 color channels. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And instead of sampling at 30 frames per second, this is sampling at 1,000 frames per second. Okay, so it is an incredible amount of data, and you're searching that data for these fast radio bursts. In fact, CHIME was not particularly built for fast radio bursts in the first place. It was built for cosmology, and then the CHIME Pulsar and CHIME FRB backends were added later. So there are 3 simultaneous experiments which are going on with the same front end. So the same data comes down, but then it is divided into 3 different instruments, 3 different computing clusters to do completely different science cases. So there is CHIME Cosmology, which records data at a 10-second cadence and records almost 210 terabytes a day. Okay. There is CHIME Pulsar, which tracks galactic pulsars every day, and it records about 700 gigabytes of data per day. Then there is CHIME FRB, which takes data from these 1024 FFT formed beams, which I was mentioning, and that we are processing about 130 gigabits per second in intensity and 800 gigabytes per second in baseband data. So that total amount of data is about 1.5 petabytes a day. Now, clearly, this is not something that we can store. So we have to process it in real time, and I'll talk about how we do that. So just to show you, Chime Cosmology's aim is to make a detailed map of the sky. And so they make a very detailed map. You can see as you go change the dynamic range, you can see very sharp details of the sky. Chime Pulsar observes a lot of pulsars, as the previous talk mentioned. Bhaswati has spoken a great deal about pulsar observations, and so Chime Pulsar does basically that. And Chime FRB tries to process all of these beams in real time to find fast radio bursts. So there are a bunch of different steps which we have very imaginatively called L0, L1, L2, L3, and L4, which just stands for level 0, level 1 processing, and so on. There are a lot of different things. You do beam forming, you do RFI accretion, incoherent de-dispersion, you do multi-beam analysis, then you decide whether something is, scientifically interesting or not, and then you do further offline analysis. So today we'll be talking about RFI accretion and incoherent de-dispersion in detail. So before we do that, let's go through. I'll take you through the Chime signal chain very briefly. So the Chime signal chain starts with the reflector, which you see here. This is the surface of the reflector, and underneath this walkway, there are the feeds, which look like this. This is a single feed held in the hand, and there are a lot of them put up under the walkway, and then the antenna is amplified. It goes through a 50-meter coaxial cable into these huts, which sit in a RF tight room. So there is no digital noise from the FPGAs and other things which come out and affect our observations in the first place. So there are these huge banks of FPGAs, which are custom designed boards, which do the digitization and the first level of processing. So you split the signal which comes in into separate frequency channels using a polyphase filter bank and so on. So that happens in these massive racks of FPGAs. So they do the channelization and so on. And then you take a lot of about 80 kilometers of optical fiber and take all of that data out. So this is a top-down view of the Chime telescope. And you can see that there are these two small huts which sit between the cylinders, and those are where the FPGAs are. And from the FPGAs, the data actually goes to the GPU huts, which are these massive shipping containers right next to the telescope. And the data comes over there for correlation. And this shipping container which you see is the FRB hut, which is where we do the searches for FRBs. So this is the GPU correlator, which sits in one of the shipping containers, actually two of the shipping containers, and that has 256 computing nodes with 4 GPUs each and almost 33 terabytes of RAM. And so this is what processes the 800 gigabytes a second of data coming from the FPGAs and produces all the data products for the real-time backends. And then you actually do the searches for FRBs, which happens here. This is the Chime FRB backend, which has 130 nodes with 2600 cores and about 17 terabytes of RAM. So this is where all the data is processed and we actually detect the FRBs. So what we have is a science pipeline, but we need to manage a huge amount of data, most of which is radio frequency interference. Most of what we get is noise. So our noise to signal ratio is about 1,000,000 to 1. For every real astrophysical signal that we get about 1,000,000 fake signals. So we have to create systems where our accuracy in identifying fake signals from astrophysical signals is 1 part in 1,000,000. Okay, so we have a modular system where we can plug together different parts of the pipeline, and each part has a well understood function. So we define a function, we build that part, and we put it together, and the interfaces are you define a common interface so that the data can pass through very smoothly across the pipeline. So when we do all of this, we get a map which is something like this. This is showing you, the brightest trigger from the match filtering as a function of north-south beams and time. And you can see that there are couple of horizontal lines which are just pulsars. So if there are bright pulsars, they show up as independent signals, and that is what we see here. And then you can have a lot of RFI as well, which shows up as these vertical lines because they show up in multiple beams. And we have to identify from this data what is actually a real FRB. So let me skip this and let's talk about the component breakdown for these FRB pipelines. So I'm going to talk about RFI accession, de-dispersion, and match filtering in more detail. But this might be a good time to stop and ask if there are any short questions about the previous section about chime or FRBs in general.
Participants, you can raise your hands, and if you have a quick question. Yes, Abhishek Jhala, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. My question is that chime instrument is very peculiar in design. It has a very cylindrical shape of dishes. So what was the challenge of defining the radio beam for such instrument?
Sorry, what was the challenge in defining the radio what?
Radio beam pattern of that instrument.
So radio beam pattern. So the beam pattern is fairly stable because there are no moving parts. And the feeds have been designed so that they are mass producible, and then we have put them together with some level of accuracy. But of course, we have to define the beam. It's really hard, as you say. If you want to measure the beam pattern, it is quite challenging. So what we do is use some sort of a holography. There are some bright sources, like the sun, for example, is a very bright source of radio waves. And we can observe the sun with a small telescope and see the pattern it makes as it goes through the chime, transits through the chime beam, and then we can get a cross section. And we do this at multiple frequencies and multiple days of the year to figure out what exactly the beam pattern is. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I don't see any other hands. Maybe we'll come back to the participants again, Shreyas.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, there's another one, Rohit. My quick question, please. Rohit, go ahead.
Audible?
Yes.
Sir, I have a question about chime. Why it was designed in cylindrical? Like any reason behind designing?
It was designed as a cylindrical telescope because it has become computationally cheaper to make beams electronically in one direction, whereas to have a reasonable collecting area, you need some sort of a curvature in the telescope in one axis. So that's why a cylindrical telescope is well suited for this kind of a mapping.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Rohit. So maybe we can come back to the participants a little bit later again.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thank you, Dipanjan. All right. So let's talk about the different systems that go into FRB detection. So first, let's talk about RFI. Right. So RFI comes from a huge number of different sources, as I mentioned. TV stations, mobiles. Nowadays, even cars have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And that causes a lot of interference. We can't stop development from happening. So we have to try to live with it. So on the top plot, I'm showing you the power spectrum at chime. So this is just power in arbitrary units as a function of frequency. So going from 400 megahertz to 800 megahertz. And you can see that there is a baseline which is due to the sky, but there are these very sharp peaks which come from narrowband RFI. There are TV channels, digital TV channels, which take up substantial parts of our observing band. And then there is LTE, which is cell phones. So these kinds of narrowband RFI, we have to basically mask out. Sometimes RFI might not be narrowband. Sometimes it can be broadband. If there is sparking or something that happens, especially in high tension lines, you'll get broadband RFI, and it will just cover the entire 400 to 800 megahertz band. Sometimes you get different patterns, as you can see from the plots here, which I've shown you before. And we need to remove this from the data without throwing out our astrophysical signal. So we want to clean it, but not clean it so much that we throw out the signals that we are looking for. So we have to spend a lot of time doing RFI excision. So on the plot on the left shows you the raw data which comes out from the telescope, and you can see that there are some channels where there is a lot of intensity variation. There are some time samples where there is a lot of intensity variation. And one of our students, Masood Ravandi, he has written this pipeline which iteratively tries to clean the data and get it to mask the data so that you actually throw out the bits which don't look reasonable. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So you can imagine that you have this intensity as a function of your time or frequency axis, and you have these points, and this is the data that we are going to work with. Okay, so let's consider a single cut across this data, either in the vertical direction or in the horizontal direction. And what we do is we do a robust detrending. So you do a detrending, but you do outlier rejection with a low order polynomial fit, and then you do it iteratively. So you first do it a couple of times along the frequency axis, then you do it a couple of times along the time axis. Sometimes you have to repeat. We repeat this almost 9 times. And the reason for doing that is that you might not get all the outliers in one iteration. So you have to repeat this till you get rid of almost all the outliers. There is a huge dynamic range difference between what RFI can produce versus where your signal lies. Okay, most of your signal is so low in individual channels that you cannot find it without a very conservative and very ruthless removal of RFI. So consider this: you have your data, right, and you fit a low order polynomial. You do a least squares fit, and so I'm putting this hand-drawn line, and that's my least squares fit. And you calculate what the standard deviation is here, and you get some value which is like this. So you find that there is this point which is many standard deviations away, right? So I mark it as red. I mark this as an outlier. Now I remove that point, right, and I can repeat this fit. So sorry, I remove that point and I also subtract the trend line. So I've subtracted whatever fit I could do from this data. Now I can try to repeat this. So I fit another trend line, right? And this time I know that the standard deviation is much smaller. So from with respect to this trend line, there is a very small standard deviation, and I get these new outliers which previously were not outliers. Okay, and so I subtract that trend line again and throw away those points, and then eventually I get this fairly clean data where it is well behaved, it is detrended, and now I can start the process of finding FRBs. So we do this for each frequency channel, and we do it for each time sample. So for along the frequency axis and along the time axis, we do this, and we have to do it multiple times so that a lot of the RFI gets masked out. Now this is extremely subjective. So what order of polynomial should you choose depends on what time scale of transients you're looking for. How many times you should repeat your iterations depends on how much noise there are. So you have to play around with the data, and RFI excision is an art which is tweaked for every different telescope. And what works for GMRT will not work for CHIME, and what works for CHIME will not work for GMRT. So you have to do it by hand, basically. So after we do that, we also implement a fair amount of machine learning. So we try to see if there are features in our data which are different for interference versus astrophysical signals. So there is a fair bit of machine learning done by Alex Josephi, one of our students, and me, where we try to look for patterns in the beams, right? So if you have an astrophysical source, you'll have some sort of intensity pattern in neighboring beams, whereas if you have RFI, you'll have a different sort of intensity pattern among different beams. So we can combine information from multiple beams and you put it into a support vector machine or a random forest classifier and try to come out with the probability that this kind of a signal is astrophysical or interference. Now the next step is de-dispersion. So as I mentioned, you have to correct for de-dispersion and you have to search for multiple DM steps. Now there are two ways to do this. One is to do a brute force method, and the other is called a tree de-dispersion. We are going to talk about both of them. But just to be clear, we are only discussing incoherent de-dispersion in this talk, where we are working with the intensity data. If you have the raw voltage data, you can do something called coherent de-dispersion, but that is incredibly computationally expensive. So it is not feasible for Chime to do it at all. So we are not going to discuss that here. So with brute force D-dispersion is a fairly simple idea. So for each dispersion measure, so this is a toy model of a dynamic spectrum, and plotted different dispersion curves, right, for different dispersion measures. Now, if I know what the dispersion is what time shift is expected for each frequency, for each DM value, what I can do to this array is to just shift the time channel, shift each frequency channel horizontally, as shown by these arrows, and then sum up the intensities along the vertical axis, right? Now this requires an independent trial for each DM. So for each DM you have to repeat this process, and this scales as the number of frequencies times the number of time samples times the number of DMs, and this becomes extremely computationally expensive. So most of the time previously was spent in doing this. You take your data, push it into a CPU or a GPU, do a lot of these parallel processes. This is embarrassingly parallel, but it is quite heavy in terms of I/O. Actually, you spend a lot of time reading data from the hard disk to your processor and back. This was the key thing which was done for a long time, and because this D-dispersion was computationally expensive, people did not search for very high DMs at all, which is what prevented people from discovering fast radio bursts before 2007. After in the past few years, it has become much cheaper to do this D-dispersion, and hence we are finding more and more fast radio bursts. Now there is a more clever way to do this. What you notice is that if you look at the time shifts for different frequency channels, they're basically the same at different points. So you have, if you look at the time shift for the first 2 bins for different dispersion measures, they're basically the same, right? And for each different frequency band, you can think of the time shift required as an internal shift within, say, these 2 bands, and an overall shift with respect to the reference, which let's say is at the highest frequency. So what this leads to is that we can reuse some of our additions to save computation. So we don't have to write back the data to disk and do the computation all over again. So if we can save some of the intermediate products, we can actually do much better. So the first step to do this is to move your data from the frequency versus time axis to frequency to the -2 and time axis. So now instead of having parabolic curves, you get straight lines in this data frame, right? So your standard D-dispersion measure has converted to straight lines. So now you have to just figure out a way to add this in, to integrate along these straight lines. Now, this is the main point of tree D-dispersion. So what you can think about is that if you take, say, the first 2 channels, right, I can make 2 kinds of sums. So you add the time samples directly without shifting, and you do one other thing where you shift the time channels and you add them. Excuse me a moment. Sorry about that. Yeah, so you can think of 2 sums which you can do. So for the first, let's say for the first 2 channels, you can add them directly without any shifting, and you can add them with 1 shift. So you can shift this channel, the second channel, rightward by 1 index, and you add them, right? So you can see that you can split this array of 8 frequency channels and whatever number of time bins into 2 different arrays, one of which has 4 channels. Each of these channels here, so the first channel here corresponds to the sum of the first 2 channels without a shift. The channel here corresponds to the sum of these first 2 channels with a single shift, okay? And so these two red points will come into the red bin here. These two purple points will come into the purple bin here, and so on. Now you can apply the same thing again, right? You can take one sample where it goes where you are adding without any shift, and one sample where you are adding with a shift. Now, if you take the sample without the shift, you get the blue points. So in the third line, you have this blue point which corresponds to 2 additional samples from the blue data. And here the green point corresponds to 2 additional added samples from the green data. Then you have a shifted one where you're taking the yellow diagonally shifted points here, and you add them to this one. You take the orange diagonally shifted ones and you add them to this orange data point, and you repeat this process. What happens is that this scales as log of NF, where NF is the number of frequencies, times NT times NDM, where NDM is the number of DM trials you're doing. Now, this becomes extremely important when NF is large. And in our case, for example, NF is 16,000. So it's 16,384 frequency channels. So when we are trying to do a de-dispersion, if you use a tree de-dispersion instead of the brute force method, you are significantly saving the computational power. So there is this very optimized recursive tree search algorithm which was written by Kendrick Smith from Perimeter Institute. I mean, the idea of tree de-dispersion has been around since the 1970s, but it had fallen by the wayside, and now it is back in order. And it is nearly statistically optimal. It performs the same amount of computation on half a core, right? That required one entire GPU. So it is a substantial saving, not just in computational power, but in actual power, because you take very little electrical power to do this search, and it is incredibly fast. So that basically solves the problem of de-dispersion. We have now done this de-dispersion very well, and it works. Now what you do is from the de-dispersion, you get a time series. So for each de-dispersion trial, you get a whole bunch of time series, and only in the time series which has the correct de-dispersion, you'll get a pulse. Then you have to search for pulses of different widths, and the standard way to do that is to convolve it with a template. Now, we don't know what FRBs look like. There is no particular specific thing that FRBs look like this. So we can't choose an absolutely optimal template. So the easiest template that we use is a boxcar, which is just zeros for a while, then you have 1 and then zeros for a while, right? And you choose the width of the boxcar to match the typical width of your FRB. It is not completely optimal, but sometimes you don't want it to be, because it might prevent you from detecting other kinds of FRBs. But it is extremely easy to implement, and it is good enough. So I'm not going to go too deep into match filtering, because match filters are well described in Wikipedia, and you can go ahead. I put a link here. You can go ahead and read more about match filters. But there are also other ways of trying to detect FRBs. For example, there is now a lot of effort going into using machine learning combined with de-dispersion to find transients. So there is this algorithm called Fetch, which is written by Devansh Agarwal, which combines convolutional neural networks and de-dispersion. So what it takes as an input is the dynamic spectrum and the de-dispersed data. So note that this is basically the same data, except that there are different projections of the data. Okay, but they show different sides of the data to the convolutional neural network. So it actually makes the CNN's life easier a little bit. And so you take both of these, you pass them through a bunch of learning layers, and then you eventually come up with a question with, is this signal a real FRB or not? And then the machine learning training basically identifies that. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for a little bit and ask if there are any questions.
Please raise your hand if you have a question here. Any quick questions? Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so maybe we can go on and then come back at the end.
Okay, thank you, Dipanjan. All right, so in the next few slides, I'm just going to talk about some philosophical aspects about designing a pipeline for unknown objects, right? Now, FRBs are new. We don't, we think that they're millisecond timescale bursts, but millisecond timescale bursts may not be the only thing that exists. Maybe there are some, very broad bursts. Maybe there are, right now we are seeing these very broadband FRBs, which show up in the 400 megahertz channel as well as the 800 megahertz channel. Maybe there are some which show up in incredibly narrow frequency channel. So what we see as an FRB may not be the only thing that is out there, right? So if you want to design a pipeline to explore a new phase space, you have a contradictory goal, right? You have two things which pull you in different directions. One is that searching for everything is searching for nothing. If you make a pipeline which searches for almost everything, then you are not going to get any useful signal. But if you design a pipeline which is very specifically designed to detect a specific kind of thing, then you will detect mostly that. You won't see what is outside. So you have to choose the scope of your pipeline very, very carefully. And then you have to understand what you're missing. So you have to try to answer this question: what is my pipeline not seeing? So doing tests for measuring the completeness of the pipeline is extremely important. So one of the things which we did for Chime is to inject fake FRBs, right? So you have this pipeline and we have data passing through it all the time. And in that data, we can inject fake FRBs saying that, okay, let's inject an FRB with this pulse width, this dispersion measure, this scattering index, and so on. And we did this 100,000 times, and you find out which of those were detected individually. Now that population gives us an idea we can create a multi-dimensional selection function, which says, okay, if you had an FRB with these properties, right, then what is the probability that it would be detected? So what that allows us to do is to correct the observed population of FRBs for the selection function. So on the bottom, I'm showing you this plot of the detected FRB. So the blue histogram is the raw catalog. So these are the numbers of FRBs which were detected, right? And on the top, I'm showing you the selection function, which is an arbitrary units, but you can see that it drops very drastically as you go to higher and higher scattering values. What it means is that the few FRBs that we detected in this part of the phase space actually correspond to a much larger population. So if you correct for the selection effect, this is the selection corrected catalog, so to speak, you see that there could be a large population of fast radio bursts which are highly scattered. Right? So we have to understand what our pipeline is doing to our data. It is extremely important. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is computers as instruments. Now, what you can see from this talk and from the previous talks as well is that transporting data is hard or nearly impossible for radio astronomy today, and in the future with SK and other things coming in, moving data is nearly impossible. It's going to be terribly difficult. And if you want to do transient detection, you have to do on-site computation. You cannot move the data around to a central computing facility and then do the detection because of the data volumes involved. So I would like to put forth the idea that these computing clusters are actually the same kind of instruments as the instruments which we put on optical telescopes. So if you have a optical telescope like this 3.6 meter Devasthal telescope, you have a spectrograph, you have an imager, and these are basically collections of mirrors, lenses, gratings, CCDs, which are very well designed and put together in a way that is calibrated for stability and low photon loss, and you have a well understood instrument. In the same way, we have these collections of FPGAs, GPUs, networking devices, and these are all tweaked for very low packet collisions, very high throughput of data. And you're processing all these. You're making the data run through very smoothly through this instrument to do the processing we need, because you simply cannot store the data. I'll just to give an example of how much it has to be tweaked, we had to actually time the packets which go from the correlator to the GPU and make sure that we are sufficiently randomizing the timing of the packet so that there are no packet collisions, and we can get a throughput of almost 99% through these UDP data sets. So with that, I will stop my talk, and as a summary, I'll just put up my outline slide, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks a lot, Shriyar, for this very wonderful overview of the various challenges faced while detecting these transients. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So participants, raise your hands. I already see a couple. Abhishek Jhala, please go ahead with your question.
First of all, sir, thank you very much for such informative talk. My question is related to the palindrome, means the false FRB trigger. So how some of the local signals can mimic FRB signal very likely. So how do you actually filter those out? Is it through machine learning or some other modes are there?
Right. So we do a lot of different things. There is no one method which works for everything. So let me see what. Sorry. Let me go back to my slides. Yeah, so we have to use multiple different ways. So one of them is to try to look for broadband signals versus narrowband signals. We have to we look for similarities in position and when things are detected in different beams. So there are some aspects of machine learning. Then we just look at the image. So as you can see here, you can look at the dynamic spectrum and see if there is a very sharp vertical edge, right? So we have some level of we have our own implementation of a convolutional neural network as well to identify that. And eventually towards the end, we still depend on human verification. So people actually take a look at the data and say, okay, this is real. So we have a web page which is designed where people can give their classification, and then we retrain our machine learning codes every once in a while based on those human classification.
Okay, sir. And sir, one last question is related to the FRB localization. Can you tell us a little about it?
Sure. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and I didn't cover too much about it. With Chime, we can roughly localize FRBs because Chime has, the localization precision depends on how far away your antennas are from each other. Okay, so in Chime, the longest baseline that we have is 80 into square root of 2, which is about 100 meters. So with that, we can get, we can roughly localize FRBs to an area of about 10 to 20 arc minutes in the sky, which has a lot of different galaxies. So we can't actually figure out which galaxy the FRB came from. So to localize FRBs to the precision where we can identify, say that, okay, this FRB came from this galaxy, we have to go to something called long baseline interferometers like GMRT, the VLA in New Mexico. So what they have is telescopes which are separated by many tens of kilometers, right? And then you can try to detect the FRB and localize it very precisely. But that is challenging because they have a very small field of view, right? So the probability that a random FRB will happen in the field of view of GMRT or VLA is very small. So what we have been doing so far is to take the repeating FRBs which are detected by Chime. So we know roughly where in the sky the repetitions occur from, and then we observe them with VLA and GMRT and try to localize them better so that we can identify the host galaxy. And other telescopes like ASCAP and MeerKAT, they have a compromise between the field of view and localization. So they can actually detect single FRBs and localize them. So they work on those aspects as well.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Abhas Pradhan, please go ahead next.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, sir, for the informative talk. My question is about so we have multi-messenger astronomy where we use information from many other frequencies to help us learn about FRBs as well and all these transients. So can we use such data from other frequencies to help train our models, especially to eliminate RFI?
Right. So there are a lot of efforts going on, including from my own team and the Chime FRB collaboration to search for counterparts of FRBs in other wavelengths. But so far we have not found anything, and there is a good reason for that. That is that FRBs are so prolific that most of them are not going to have detectable counterparts. So the rate of FRBs, detectable FRBs is 1,000 FRBs every day. The rate of detectable gamma ray bursts or GRBs is about one per day or one per 2 days. Right. So clearly not all FRBs can have detectable GRB counterparts. And this is mostly because radio telescopes are exquisitely sensitive, whereas high energy telescopes in X-rays, gamma rays, optical, you need a lot of energy astrophysically to produce a detectable signal. So we are looking for coincidences between FRBs and GRBs, FRBs and gravitational wave events from LIGO, and so on. But that is mostly from the scientific interest of actually detecting an interesting transient, but not from the point of view of being able to reduce the effect of RFI. So RFI we are basically fighting alone right now. Some of the kinds of things that we can take into account for RFI, for example, is aircraft. So, for example, if some of the RFI in Chime is caused by aircrafts flying overhead, and you get this sort of a diffraction pattern when the aircraft goes overhead. So here, what I've plotted is just the paths of different aircraft from a database of aircraft positions, and the number of events which are detected in Chime at that time. So you can see that when the aircraft, so the red dot here is centered on the Chime position, and you can see that when aircraft fly overhead over Chime, we do detect a very high rate of false events. And so we can use information like this. We can use environmental information. So some of the radio telescopes have small dishes which are pointed towards the horizon, and that basically looks at terrestrial interference. And you take that signal and then you correlate it with the signal coming from your main telescope, and then you subtract whatever gets correlated. So ideally you should remove almost all of RFI. So there are a lot of efforts going on in that sense as well.
Thank you, sir.
But before going to the next person, maybe I can just ask a question related to this. So, Shreyas, regarding this finding the counterparts, I think this is a very challenging thing, and a lot of effort is being put in. Are the focus now mostly towards the high energies, or are you also expecting this to be found in the, say, from LSST or some other optical bands, where more effort is going on worldwide to increase the the sensitivities of the telescopes?
Right. Yeah. So there are a lot of efforts with optical telescopes as well, and that is because so there are people who have fast readout CCDs which can do detections at millisecond time scale. So we have used those to look at repeaters and see if there is any repeat burst coming from that. And we have put limits on them. We have had no detections. Similarly, there are other wide field of view optical telescopes, like as you mentioned, LSST, which could detect some of these fast transients. But so yeah, I didn't mean to say that their optical areas are not being searched. There is a lot of effort going on in optical counterparts as well. So when I say as a high energy as a radio astronomer, I mean everything above millimeter wave.
Sure. But I was just wondering, where do you think is the most probable thing to find the counterpart first? Are you expecting more for the high energies like gamma ray counterparts, or and there is no, because this will come from the theoretical models, I presume, but there is no preference.
Yeah, so there is, I mean, there is no particular preference. You probably could find optical counterparts as well, the benefit for going to higher energies is that you already have telescopes which have a wide field of view. So, for example, there was this burst from SGR 1935, a magnetar, in April 2020, right, where we detected an X-ray flare and a very bright radio burst. This was basically a galactic FRB. Right? It was the brightest radio event we have ever seen. And we detected X-rays and radio coming at the same time from this magnetar. Now, but obviously there is no optical observation because you have to point the optical telescope and you have to be lucky to get that. So in that sense, X-rays are probably more likely for detection than optical.
Okay. Thanks, Shreyas. Hari, next, please go ahead with your question. I see your hands raised.
Hi, sir. Thank you for the talk. I had a question about the neural network side. So, how was the training done? Like the known FRBs are, as I understand, it's not that many. So, how was the training done, and how was the generalization ensured? Yeah,
that's a very good question. What we do is that we have a lot of RFI for training, so there's no dearth of that, and we have pulsar signals which are basically similar to FRBs except that they have different dispersion measures. So we have some of those, and we can also simulate what a typical FRB would look like. Okay, so we try to imagine what FRBs could look like, and then simulate that, add it over a real noise background from a real telescope, and then use that as the training, and then you can how do you say, you can expand your training set just by trying to do slightly different dispersion measures, making your time scale wider or narrower, and so on.
Okay, and I just had one more small question. Like, what is the pooling used here in the CNN?
That I don't know off the top of my head, but I can point you to the paper, and then you can have a look at it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's all.
Okay, maybe we'll take a last quick question. Abhishek Jhala, I see you have raised your hand again. Do you have another question?
Yes, sir. Actually, you mentioned about the magnetar from the galaxy, which showed a very bright radio burst. And recently, there have been a few papers related to that magnetars can be a progenitor. So, is there a future of FRB to detect, study magnetar as well as wideband survey to correspond both of them?
Yeah, there are a lot of efforts going on to find search for bursts from magnetar, search for FRBs from magnetars in neighboring galaxies, and so on. But magnetars are only one model. There are we have seen a lot of FRBs in locations where you don't expect magnetars at all. So, for example, there is this recently found FRB which was in the middle of a globular cluster, which is a very old stellar population. So you don't typically expect a magnetar there. So if it was a magnetar, it would be a very weird kind of magnetar. So it is, it seems likely that magnetars definitely contribute a fair fraction of FRBs. In what emission mechanism, we don't know. But there is also a huge scope for other kinds of sources to create FRBs. And so magnetars, as we know them from our galaxy, don't explain all FRBs.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so I don't see any new hands up. Abbas Pradhan, I still see your hands up. Do you have any question?
No, sir. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So let us thank Shreyas once again for this fantastic talk. It's very interesting discussion.
There is another hand raised from Mrinal Deb.
Oh, Mrinal Deb. Yes, Mrinal, go ahead.
Hello, sir.
Yes, go on.
Yes, sir. Very good noon, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I can hear you.
Audible? I am audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, sir. Sir, have any sound have in FRB signals?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? Hello?
Mrinal, can you repeat the question, please? We didn't really catch it.
Sir,
Mrinal,
any sound have the FRV signals? Any sound in FRV signals?
No, I mean, so these are radio waves, right? So there is no sound per se. Sound can't travel in space, so there is no sound. But of course, you know, you can. I have converted FRB signals to sounds. If you want to hear them, you can. You know, there are things on YouTube where we have converted FRB actual radio signals to sounds. But in general, you don't detect any sounds from FRBs or any astrophysical source.
right. Thanks, Mrinal, for your question. I don't see any other fresh hands. Any other questions for Sriharsh? Okay. So if not, let us thank Sriharsh once again for this very fantastic talk and interesting discussion about FRBs. So Sriharsh, thank you. And
Thank you guys.
Hello, sir.
So if you have any other questions, you can write to the CCTS email that is given in the workshop webpage, and we'll get back to you by email.